I think the first thing people get wrong is they look at China like a command economy because they see the name, Chinese Communist Party on the wall. And they assume this is a command economy and therefore it can't work. The assumption of most foreign investors is that if you argue that something is working in China, that must mean that you believe in command and control economies, and B, you're obviously wrong because command economies don't work, and so it's all going to implode and blow up in your face. And I think this is a fairly Manichaean approach, sort of black and white, which doesn't really correspond to an underlying economic reality. There's no doubt that China was that 50 years ago. When China was under Mao rule, you couldn't even decide what you were going to wear in the morning. Everybody had to wear the same thing. You couldn't decide where you were going to work. You couldn't decide, it was a total command and control economy. But the story really of the past 40, 50 years has been by and large a story of gradual deregulation. First you deregulate labor, then you deregulate land, then you deregulate natural resources. And now we're going through the phase of the deregulation of the world of capital, which, these things, it's never a straight line. It's always sort of 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. So I think that's the first thing people get wrong. I think the other thing people get wrong is they underestimate the level of competition that is prevalent around China. Essentially, competition at all levels, including, very importantly, between local governments, which is how you end up in the situation like you have right now, where if you look at China, I think you've got like 100 EV makers, because what happens is at the very top, Xi Jinping says, hey guys, we need to be the biggest EV producer in the world. And if I'm the mayor of Shanghai or the provincial governor of Guangdong or the party secretary in Zhejiang, I go home and I say, okay, if I want to get the next job, the big boss told me I need to produce electric cars. And so I turn around and I call Tesla, if I'm the mayor of Shanghai, and I say, hey, Tesla, why don't you come here? I'll give you some free land and I'll give you some free electricity. And then, the state next door, the province next door, Zhejiang says, oh, well, that worked out well for them. Let's do some of this. And so you end up in situations where, as soon as you have a successful business model, you might have 100 competitors, funded by 100 different local authorities. And deep down, that's actually quite good for the consumer. Today in China, you can buy a great BYD car with full self-drive for $7,500. And so for the end consumer, it's a good deal. For the shareholders, it can be tough because, as soon as you have what you think is a pretty unique business, there's actually a competitor that gets subsidized right next door. And so, these are the sort of unique characteristics of Chinese capitalism that I think most people who say, oh, well, everything is controlled by the central government who allocates resources, etc., just get completely wrong. It's a very, very different competitive and domestic economic landscape over there. So I think to understand where you are today, you actually have to go back 7 or 8 years, because 7 or 8 years ago, you had a massive, massive shock to the Chinese economy. Essentially, the US imposed a semiconductor embargo on China, and the leadership felt, okay, the US just declared economic war on us. They transformed what was a trade war into a tech war, saying, look, we just don't want you to move up the value chain, and so we're going to block you from having access to the high-end semiconductors. Now, the government's reaction to this was essentially to say, okay, if they're blocking us from semiconductors today, tomorrow it could be chemical products, it could be auto parts, it could be anything. We have to totally, and it's not just the US, because the US can tell ASML not to sell us machines, it can tell TSMC not to sell us chips. So we have to totally de-Westernize our supply chains. And so starting in 2018, you see this very clearly in the lending data. The banks are essentially told by the government, guys, no more loans to real estate, normal loans to the consumer, all the money has to go into industry because we have to move up the industrial value chain much quicker than we thought we did before. It's a question of economic survival, that we need to build resiliency and independence in our industrial supply chains. And so you had a period for 7 years where all of China's savings, and those savings are massive, all of China's savings essentially went into industry. Now, this represented a massive deflationary shock for China and for the world. It was actually a twin deflationary shock. The first shock was as you starved real estate of capital, real estate prices went down, consumers tightened their belt, property developers went bust, commodity prices went down. This was the balance sheet recession that, everybody wrote about for 7 years. You couldn't pick up a copy of the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times without being told of this balance sheet recession. But the conclusion people took from it was the wrong one. Everybody looked at this and said, oh, this is Japan all over again. Except that it's not. Because in Japan, bank lending totally collapsed. In China, bank lending all went into industry. And what I think most people missed during those 7 years is how quickly China was moving up this value chain. Now, first, because it had unlimited access to capital, but also, and I think this is the part that everybody underestimates, is over that period, the Chinese workforce dramatically changed. What do I mean? I went to China to university in the mid-90s, and back then, China was graduating 350,000 university students a year. Today, China graduates 12 million university students a year. I mean, no country has gone in one generation, because I'm 52, has gone from 350 to 12 million. It's mind-boggling. So what you had, and by the way, roughly half of these guys are engineers and science graduates. So just at the time when money was pouring into industry, essentially China was also producing just an insane number of engineers. So, you mentioned Rupert in the intro. I was with Rupert visiting BYD, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. I can't remember, 3 weeks ago maybe. BYD has 120,000 engineers in their R&D department. Now, to put things in context, Tesla has 85,000 workers, not in their R&D department, just 85,000 workers, including the guys on the factory chain, tightening the bolts, etc. So BYD in their R&D department has 50% more workers than Tesla. So money absolutely poured into industry. And I think what the world missed was as all this money, as all these human resources poured in, China very rapidly moved up the value chain. If I told you in 2020, guys, by 2023, China will be exporting more cars than any other countries, you would have laughed in my face. And if I had said by 2025, you'll visit BYD and you'll wish you could buy those cars in your country, you would have been you would have kicked me out of the room and called me ridiculous. But yet here we are. And so what you've seen on cars, and I think people now realize it, because as soon as you travel, if you go to Brazil, if you go to South Africa, if you go to Saudi Arabia, you see the Chinese cars everywhere. What you've seen on cars, it's the same thing for tractors, it's the same thing for ships, it's the same thing for turbines, it's the same thing for nuclear power plants. It's essentially anything linked to automation and robotics, anything linked to transportation outside of jet planes, anything linked to energy storage, energy transmission, energy generation. By now, China has actually leapfrogged the West, where it's producing, thanks to all these people and all this money that's gone into it, it's producing better products at a cheaper price. So that was I think that the second big deflationary shock. So that brings you to today. Sorry, it's a long-winded answer to your question, but that brings you to today. You have to understand where you are today. You've had this balance sheet recession, this deflationary shock for China, for the world, that was a direct result of essentially a geostrategic imperative. A geostrategic imperative of we need to cushion our economy against U.S. attacks. 2018, the U.S. punches China on the face. China has no choice but to take the punch. So it takes the punch. 21, Biden comes back to power. China thinks this is going to be better. It's actually worse. So China gets punched in the face again, can't do anything except go to the gym, get jacked, get strong. So that by 25, when Trump comes back in, And this time Trump is pissed when he comes back in. And he doesn't just punch China. He punches Canada, he punches Mexico, he punches Europe, punches absolutely everybody because he's angry. The one country that is able to stand up because they've spent the past 7 years getting fit in the gym is China. So, US goes to punch China, says, okay, you want to go? Let's go. Gloves off. Let's go. Let's do this. You tariff me, I tariff you. You embargo me, I embargo you. And that brings you to the meetings in Geneva, Kuala Lumpur, Seoul that we just had, where essentially the US is forced to back off. The US is forced to back off because you have the CEO of Raytheon that says in 3 weeks, I can't produce missiles. You have Ford shutting down factories because they don't have access to rare earths. And so all of a sudden, the main method of pressure that the US has is high-end semiconductors. And China with DeepSeek and with Quen has shown that actually we can do AI without the high-end semiconductors. That brings me to one of my favorite quotes. And I've written a piece about this. It's your listeners who follow me on Twitter can get that piece off my, I've opened it. It's a free distribution on my Twitter. If you go back to World War II, Rommel, the famous German tank commander, would say, our Tiger tanks is worth 4 of their Sherman tanks. The problem is the Americans always show up with 5. And this is where China is today. Today, everybody's running around saying, at AI, China can't compete because it doesn't have the NVIDIA chips. That's like saying the US can't compete with Germany because it can't produce as good a tank as the Sherman tank. When it comes to conflict, when it comes to challenges, there's a beauty in volume. And this is China's comparative advantage. The US's comparative advantage of World War II, which was essentially being the world's leading industrial power and being able to produce 10 Sherman tanks for every one German Tiger tank, that has now shifted to China. And so the US now essentially has no choice but to back down, which allows China to now embrace completely different sets of policies. Sorry, it's a very long-winded answer again, but it's very important to understand this, that 5 years ago, 7 years ago, if you were Xi Jinping, before you put on your pants in the morning, your concern was, how do I cushion my economy from US attacks? That was your number one concern. Today, you no longer worry about this. That ship has sailed. In fact, now it's the US that has to worry, how can I get rare earths? How do I make sure that my car plants don't shut down? How do I make sure that I can still produce missiles for Ukraine, for Israel? That is now, the concern has shifted. Instead, if you're China now, the concern is my people aren't getting married anymore. They're not having kids. My birth rate is collapsing because, the balance sheet recession has hit the millennials, your 25 to 40-year-olds. It's hit the millennials really, really hard. They've been the bag holders in the balance sheet recession. And so now you have to essentially help those guys out. And so now if you look at the 5-year plan of 5 years ago, it was all about increasing supply. Now the 5-year plan is all about increasing demand. And so today you turn around and China is now running budget deficits of 10% of GDP, second biggest economy in the world. And I think this matters, not just for China, of course, consequences, China's having a bull market, etc. But globally, even if you say, I don't care about what's happening in China, I don't want to hear about it, I hate the place, even if you're the most neoconservative of neoconservatives, the reality remains that for 7 years, China was a huge deflationary drag for the world. It followed a very deflationary policy, which allowed the US, Europe, Japan to follow very easy fiscal, very easy monetary policies because China was such a deflationary drag. The days of China being that deflationary drag are now going to be behind us. Now, I'm not saying, that China is going to be this big inflationary shock, but at the margin, China's deflationary impact is now abating. They're following much more reflationary policies. And as they follow reflationary policies, you are seeing the impact on the market. You're seeing the impact on the market through the outperformance of emerging market debt. the outperformance of emerging market equities, the outperformance of metals, the outperformance of miners. The one reflationary trade that hasn't really worked yet is energy. But if that does, then we move into a very, very different investment environment. That was the core belief. And in fairness, GDP growth and employment growth was weak from 2009 to 2016. It really was. Like if you go back and look at the numbers.
Yeah, Reinhardt and Rogoff didn't even have AI. Look what happened.
That's right. But so if you go back to then, essentially there were no constraints to U.S. policy, right? There were no constraints to U.S. policy because there was no inflation in the system. And back then, the U.S. had a super cheap currency. The U.S. dollar was super, super cheap. It had the cheapest cost of energy thanks to the shale revolution. Price of nat gas had collapsed, etc. And with the cheap currency, it had a cheap cost of labor. So you go back to 2009, the U.S. had cheap cost of labor, cheap cost of currency, cheapest cost of energy, and basically unlimited government support. The Fed would do QE1, QE2, QE3, push money into the economy. The economy didn't really need that money because it was growing pretty slowly. The real estate didn't really need that money because the real estate market was on its back. So the money naturally flowed into equities who re-rated. This is exactly what you're seeing in China today. So if in 2009, the cheapest cost of energy, to answer, Ben Hunt's point of who's got access to electricity, who's got access to energy. If in 2009, it was the US, today, it's China. Like China's cost of energy is a fraction of the United States. China today produces more electricity than the US and Europe combined. You take a province like Shandong. Shandong is, to put things in perspective, it's like the Michigan of China, if you want. It's a northeast Rust Belt province, a lot of steel production, a lot of rubber, a lot of sort of old industry. Well, between May and September in Shandong, electricity is, during the daytime, electricity is essentially free because they put in so much solar capacity that they can't store it. So this is, what's fascinating to me is if you go back to 2006, 2007, so 20 years ago, the nat gas price in the US was around $10. In the past 20 years, the nat gas price has gone from $10 down to $2, and the electricity price over the same period has gone up 50%. Now, why is that? Because the US has not invested in its grid. Because the grid you have today is the same grid you had 20 years ago. Grids deteriorate, you lose efficiency over the grid, etc. Now, China's grid is brand new. And China's nuclear power plants are brand new, and solar panels are brand new. And so today, China's cost of electricity, because of the investments of the past decade, investments incidentally that we forced them to make, we being the Western world, we forced them to make because they were so worried of essentially being cut off by the Western world that we forced them to up their game. So today, where is there plentiful electricity and cheap electricity? It's in China. Where is there plentiful and cheap labor? If in 2009 it was the US, today it is in China. We wrote a piece, it's also unlocked on my Twitter actually, wrote a piece on productivity. You take the best example of productivity for me is comparing the Shanghai Tesla factory to the Fremont Tesla factory. They produce the same cars. They produce twice as many cars per worker in Shanghai than they do in the US. And the worker in Shanghai costs a fifth of the cost as the workers in the US. And that's for salaries. Forget throwing a healthcare cost on top of it. So the bottom line is that, in China today, everybody's running around saying it's uninvestable. But to Ben Hunt's point, where do you have cheap labor? Where do you have cheap electricity? Where do you have the cheapest cost of capital? And where do you have the cheapest currency in the world? And where do you have now active government support for the markets because you have a government that's actively pushing reflation? So to me, China looks like the US did in 2009, 2010. Everybody's going around saying, it's a short-term rally at best. It's going to be a lost decade. Japan, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, the market grinds higher every day. So I don't think that's how it's framed in China, to be honest. But I do think the US and China are on totally different paths when it comes to AI. Again, partly because of the restrictions we the Western world imposed on China. I think what we've done in the Western world, when you look at ChatGPT, Anthropic, all those guys, is they've looked back at the past 15 years and essentially concluded the big winner of the past 15 years is Apple, because they had a closed-end system where they control their customers, and they can, gradually always increase prices on their customers. Some may drop off, but the Apple ecosystem is an absolute wonder to behold, right? And as it became clear that Apple had this wonderful ecosystem, the stock price got re-rated from 8 times earnings to 35 times earnings. All this to say that in the US, the push of the OpenAIs, the ChatGPTs, the Anthropics, etc., has been to try to create closed-end systems where I create a closed-end system and, I sell it to big corporates, and essentially they're hostage to my AI solution. China, because it never had the option of throwing computing power on top of computing power to solve problems, because we denied it to them, we the Western world denied it to them, had no choice but to embrace open AI solutions. So it's actually ironic because the US is called the main player in the US is called OpenAI, but is anything but. It's a closed-end system. Meanwhile, DeepSeek, Qwen are very much open-ended systems. And again, I don't think this was necessarily a policy choice by China. It was just what came out of necessity. But what you're now seeing is, I don't know if you guys saw, but Andreessen Horowitz recently declared, one of the biggest VC firms in the world, they recently declared that 80% of the startups that come to knock on their door to ask for money now use Chinese LLMs, and they do so not so much because of the cost, although that might be part of it, but very much because it's an open-ended solution. So you can take the Chinese platform and modify it to your needs. While if you try to do that with ChatGPT, it's going to cost you an absolute bomb because you have to ask them, it takes time, they go back and forth, back and forth. This is essentially what the Airbnb boss also said. The Airbnb at the last earnings results, the CEO said, look, we used to use ChatGPT. We've now switched to Qwen, the Alibaba platform, because we take the Alibaba platform, we got, 10 software guys internally who can modify it to our tailor it to our needs, and off we go. And so, for me, the AI war, to use your term, is not a war between, say, US and China. It's a war between conceptualization as to how we're going to use AI. And is it going to be a closed-end system where security is absolutely paramount, which you can have on a closed-end system? Or is it going to be an open-ended system in which functionality is paramount? I think this is the battle line, and most users won't care whether it comes from China or the United States. Investing in China has been a very tough place to deploy capital, partly because, there's a lot of capital there. They've got a high savings rate. They don't necessarily need your money. So, for somebody like Cuppy, who indeed likes to provide money to people who have access to none, like right now, it's actually, there are things to do. And because you've had a lot of people, whether in real estate, but even in some of the consumer names, etc., that have been deprived of capital. So for a guy like Cuppy, there is now actually things to do, and there wasn't before. The way I look at it personally is, it's a tough place to invest. What you have to do is try to you have to look for niches. So either you look for a niche of a company that is advanced enough that it'll be very hard for anybody else to compete. And historically, you never really had those in China because they were always at the low end of the manufacturing scale. So if you could throw money at it, you could always replicate. But you are now starting to see companies that are genuinely original. I'll give you an example of a company I went to visit. Actually, after all those guys had left, I went up to Shanghai. I met up with a company called Hesai. Now they're the biggest, they're pretty much the only LiDAR producer that matters in the world now. Now, there's a big debate around self-drive cars, autonomous driving, whether you should go with cameras or you should go with LiDARs. And Elon Musk keeps saying, LiDARs are useless. Cameras are the future. But that essentially is the debate. Now, I think part of the reason Elon Musk was against LiDARs was that 5 years ago, equipping a car with LiDARs would cost over $35,000 US. So you could see how it's like, okay, that's going to double the price of my car. And nobody's going to want to buy that. Now, Hesai comes along. They now have this a factory outside of Shanghai, and it's not the kind of factory that you imagine in your head being a Chinese factory, with like a bunch of 5-year-olds on an assembly chain. It's anything but that. It's literally 50 engineers. And
see this enginering
just
point
automated.
you said about the ratios before, because this is going to stick with me for a long time. Yeah. Okay.
This is it. It's like 50 engineers, and it's like all automated. The joke in China is that the factory of the future has one guard dog and one guard, and the guard is there to feed the guard dog, and the guard dog is there to bite the man if he tries to touch the machines. And so the factories have changed dramatically. So you look at a company like Hesai, it used to be 35, 40 grand to equip a car with LiDARs 5 years ago. Guess what it is today? It's $200.
$200.
200.
Amazing.
$200.
Wow. Amazing.
It's $200. So now actually, Hesai's pitch now, and so they've signed contracts with Mercedes, with BMW, obviously with BYD, with Li Autos, with all the Chinese guys. But the pitch now no longer is, oh, you need this for autonomous driving. The pitch is, with LiDAR, fatality rates in accidents go down 90%. So just like every car has to have an airbag because it reduces the fatality rate, actually for safety reasons, every car should have a LiDAR. Now, if you think that's a possibility that this happens, so that's how they're lobbying now in Washington, in Brussels, etc. If that happens, essentially by now they control 75% of the global market, and they're such an efficient producer that they'll control 90% of the market. And nobody, given the patents that they have, it's going to be very hard to compete with them. So in all this to say that in China, you're starting to get these kinds of companies that you didn't have in the past that can own a niche that is a very high-end technical precision niche, which again, like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, those kinds of companies would have been a Japanese company or a German company. And now you are getting them in China. So that's one path that's very exciting because that's new. The other path of investing in China is you either invest in the companies that are, so big that nobody can compete with them, the Tencents, the Alibabas, etc. So a bit the same story. You own Facebook and you own Google because you kind of have to. So that's one path. And to be very clear, Tencent is my single biggest position. I think it's an absolute world-class company that essentially makes sense, makes pennies on every single Chinese person out there. So you can go down that path. And the third path is to say, okay, I'm going to invest in parts of the markets that are highly regulated so that there can't be too much competition, but parts that still have growth. So for example, Macau casinos, or for example, life insurance companies. There's essentially 3 major players and you're not going to get new ones. So that, that's how you look at it. But yeah, let's not kid around. It's been a tough place to make money. China, when there was an opportunity to set capital on fire, China would jump on it. Historically, that's just what they did because they were always in a capital-rich environment. And this time, it is the U.S. that is going down the path of, let's throw money at this. We'll figure out later if there's any returns, whatever. We need to be number one, so we'll just absolutely plow money. It's such a Chinese approach to the world. And yes, to your point, China never had that option, not because it didn't have the money, but because it couldn't buy the chips to do this. And so, for whatever reason, they've all gone. The U.S., China's been, capital smart about the AI development, but also perhaps, in fairness, China had another alternative, which was to throw bodies at this. You look at DeepSeek, they could just throw thousands and thousands of engineer hours onto this in a way that it would have been very costly if you were trying to do that in San Francisco, right? So you could replace I'm going to plow money into this with I'm going to plow man hours into this because my man hours are nowhere near as expensive as your man hours. So, but the bottom line indeed is very much that this time around, it is the U.S. that is proving extremely capital intensive. It is in the U.S. that growth is now proving capital intensive. And on this, one of my favorite quotes about markets is that, in a bull market, companies get rewarded for spending capital aggressively, and in a bear markets, they get rewarded for getting rid of the things they bought in the bull market. And I'm wondering whether right now we're not seeing that transition, because you look at Oracle. Oracle announces, "Hey, I'm going to spend $300 billion on data centers," and the share price rips. But then so does the CDS spreads and the cost of funding for Oracle, as everybody's like, hold on, how are you going to fund this? And then the share prices collapses. So, when it comes to AI in the US, you've gone through 3 years where you were always rewarded for throwing more money at the problem. The more money you could spend at the problem, the more your share price went up. And this may now be ending in front of our eyes. This may, it feels like we're transitioning from all of a sudden, the market is no longer rewarding you for being stupid with capital.